Roosevelt was born on January 30th, 1882, in Hyde Park, New York. He was born into a wealthy family as the only child of James Roosevelt and Sarah Ann Delano Roosevelt, and a distant cousin of President Theodore Roosevelt. The Roosevelts had been prominent for several generations, having made their fortune in real estate and trade, and lived at Springwood, their estate in the Hudson River Valley of New York State. While growing up, Roosevelt was surrounded by privilege and a sense of self-importance. He was educated by tutors and governesses until age 14, and the entire household revolved around him, with his mother being the dominant figure in his life, even into adulthood. His upbringing was very unlike the common people whom he would later champion. In 1896, Roosevelt attended Groton School for Boys, a prestigious Episcopal preparatory school in Massachusetts. The experience was a difficult one for him, as he did not fit in with the other students. Groton men excelled in athletics, and Roosevelt did not. After graduating from Groton in 1900, Roosevelt entered Harvard University, determined to make something of himself. Though only a C student, he was a member of the Alpha Delta Phi fraternity, editor of the Harvard Crimson newspaper, and received his degree in only 3 years. However, the general consensus by his contemporaries was that he was underwhelming and average. Roosevelt went on to study law at Columbia University Law School and passed the bar exam in 1907, though he didn't receive a degree. For the next 3 years, he practiced corporate law in New York, living the typical upper-class life. But Roosevelt found law practice boring and restrictive. He set his sights on greater accomplishments. Roosevelt married Eleanor Roosevelt, his 5th cousin and the niece of Theodore Roosevelt, on March 17, 1905. The couple became engaged during Roosevelt's last year at Harvard. Franklin and Eleanor went on to have 6 children: Anna, James, Franklin, who died as an infant, Elliot, Franklin Jr., and John. Except for John, who chose a career as a businessman, all of the Roosevelt's children had careers in politics and public service. In 1914, Roosevelt developed a relationship with Lucy Mercer, his wife's social secretary, which evolved into a love affair. When Eleanor discovered the affair, she gave Franklin an ultimatum in 1918 to stop seeing Lucy, or she would file for divorce. Roosevelt agreed to stop seeing Mercer romantically, but years later began secretly see Mercer again. She was, in fact, with him at the time of his death. In 1910, at age 28, Roosevelt was invited to run for the New York State Senate. He ran as a Democrat in a district that had voted Republican for the past 32 years. Through hard campaigning and the help of his name, he won the seat in a Democratic landslide. During the 1912 National Democratic Convention, Roosevelt supported presidential candidate Woodrow Wilson and was rewarded with an appointment as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, the same job Theodore Roosevelt had used to catapult himself to the presidency. In 1914, Roosevelt decided to run for the U.S. Senate seat for New York. The proposition was doomed from the start, as he lacked White House support. President Wilson needed the Democratic political machine to get his social reforms passed and ensure his re-election. He could not support Roosevelt, who had made too many political enemies among New York Democrats. Roosevelt was soundly defeated in the primary election and learned a valuable lesson that national stature could not defeat a well-organized local political organization. Still, Roosevelt took to Washington politics and found his career thriving as he developed more personal relationships. At the 1920 Democratic Convention, he accepted the nomination for vice president as James M. Cox's running mate. The pair was soundly defeated by Republican Warren G. Harding in the general election, but the experience gave Roosevelt national exposure. In 1921, at the age of 39, Roosevelt was diagnosed with polio while vacationing at Campobello Island, New Brunswick, Canada. At first, refusing to accept that he was permanently paralyzed, Roosevelt tried numerous therapies and even bought the Warm Springs Resort in Georgia, seeking a cure. Despite his efforts, he never regained the use of his legs. He later established a foundation at Warm Springs to help others and instituted the March of Dimes program that eventually funded an effective polio vaccine. Roosevelt's Little White House at Warm Springs is now a Georgia state park and a National Historic Landmark. For a time, Roosevelt was resigned to being a victim of polio, believing his political career to be over. But his wife Eleanor and political confidant Lewis Howe encouraged him to continue on. Over the next several years, Roosevelt worked to improve his physical and political image. He taught himself to walk short distances in his braces, and he was careful not to be seen in public using his wheelchair. Following the stock market crash of 1929, Republicans were being blamed for the Great Depression. Sensing opportunity, Roosevelt began his run for the presidency by calling for government intervention in the economy to provide relief, recovery, and reform. His upbeat, positive approach and personal charm helped him defeat Republican incumbent Herbert Hoover in November 1932. When FDR ran for his second term in 1936, he was re-elected to office on November 3, 1936, in a landslide against Alfred M. Alf Landon, the governor of Kansas. Early in 1940, Roosevelt had not publicly announced that he would run for an unprecedented third term as president. But privately, in the middle of World War II, with Germany's victories in Europe and Japan's growing dominance in Asia, FDR felt that only he had the experience and skills to lead America in such trying times. At the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, Roosevelt swept aside all challengers and received the nomination. In November 1940, he won the presidential election against Republican Wendell Willkie. As the end of FDR's third term as president neared, the U.S. was deeply involved in war, and there was no question that he would run for a fourth term. Roosevelt selected Missouri Senator Harry S. Truman as his running mate, and together they defeated Republican candidate Thomas E. Dewey in the presidential election of 1944, carrying 36 of the 48 states. On the afternoon of April 12, 1945, Roosevelt suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage and died. The stress of World War II had taken its toll on his health, and in March 1944, hospital tests indicated he had atherosclerosis, coronary artery disease, and congestive heart failure. By Roosevelt's side at his death were two cousins, Laura Delano and Margaret Suckley, and his former mistress, Lucy Mercer Rutherford, by then a widow, with whom he had maintained his relationship. Within hours of Roosevelt's passing, Vice President Harry S. Truman was summoned to the White House where he took the oath of office. FDR's sudden death shook the American public to its core. Though many had noticed that he looked exhausted in photographs and newsreels, no one seemed prepared for his passing. In the annals of American history, Roosevelt is regarded as one of the greatest presidents ever to lead the nation. His name is routinely mentioned alongside those of George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. FDR's leadership and courage during the worst years of the Great Depression and World War II are remembered as his lasting achievements. As one biographer noted, he lifted himself from a wheelchair to lift the nation from its knees.